시간이 지금 6시가 좀 넘어서 좀 애매모호한 시간이죠. 예. 제 3회 코리아 국제포럼이 월요일부터 시작해서 오늘 이제 금요일까지 낮까지에 다가왔습니다. 이제 이 행사가 끝나면 마지막 폐막 종합 토론회를 하는 걸로 이제 마치게 되겠는데요. 이번 제 3회 국제 포럼은 크게 봐서 3가지 주제로 진행되고 있습니다. 첫 번째는 그 신자유주의 원인을 진단하고 그런 대안을 논의하는 것. 그 다음에 코리아 반도의 평화와 통일을 논의하는 것. 특히 이 코너에는 사이프러스라든지 베트남이라든지 독일이라든지 이러한 분단과 통일의 경험을 가진 석학들이 같이 참여해서 토론해왔습니다. 그리고 마지막으로는 지역 차원의 대안을 논의하는 것, 이런 겁니다. 오늘은 그 중에서도 우리 페드로 파에즈 선생님을 모시고 신자유주의의 대안 중심으로 이렇게 강연을 듣는 자입니다. 저 소개를 올리겠습니다. 저는 민주노동당 세상연구소에서 상임연구원이라고 있는 김장민 연구원이라고 합니다. 네, 반갑습니다. 그럼 오늘 강연자를 소개드리겠습니다. 물론 이제 많이 아실 텐데요. 오늘 강연자는 페드로 파에즈는 에콰도르 대학교 경제학과 교수로 이제 계시고요. 그 전에는 우리로 치면 경제기획 장관이라고 할 수 있겠죠. 경제정책 조정 장관을 역임하셨습니다. 그리고 중앙은행장을 역임하셨고요. 몇 차례 강연을 통해서 아주 풍부한 이론과 또 사례를 들어가면서 아주 격전 높은 이런 포럼을 주도하고 계십니다. 오늘 순서를 말씀드리면 먼저 약 1시간 동안에 신자유주의 대안에 대해서 우리 페드로 파에즈 선생님이 준비하신 강연 내용을 듣고 그 이후에 약 30분 동안은 우리 한국의 FTA 관련해서 에콰도르에서 FTA 협정을 중단시킨 그런 사례가 있기 때문에 그런 사례 중심으로 저와 대담을 통해서 간단하게 질의응답을 하는 그런 시간을 갖겠습니다. 그래서 먼저 준비하신 약 1시간 동안의 신자유주의에 대한 부분에 대해서 강의를 해드리고 우리 선생님이 나오시면 큰 박수 부탁드리겠습니다. 페드로 파에즈 선생님.
Minas, compañeros, thank you very much. I'm very, very happy to be here and to participate in the construction of the democratic forces in Asia and in the construction of bridges between the democratic forces in Latin America, Asia, and all around the world. The question that the comrades presented me to discuss this evening is a crucial question today. Not because any academic specific interest, but because it is the point of departure, the point of organization of the correct structure, the correct line of politics. And I'll try to show you that the world as we knew it is over. And politics as we knew it are over too. Because this is a structural crisis. It's a commonplace to say it, but we have to assume the full consequences of that assertion. First of all, I need to place the problem of neoliberalism. You can have, like with an onion, you can have different layers of gravity, severity of the crisis. There are several analyses that could present the idea, the notion that the crisis is only a product of the excesses, the personal excesses of some economic and political actors. Corruption among some bankers, neglect for some regulators, and incompetence. Of course, there is a lot of this, but this is not the real problem. Even if you can solve these problems, even if you can prosecute the culprits of this type of excesses, the roots of the problem are going to remain there. More so, you can go further and say, okay, capitalism operates in cycles. You have boom and boosts, a normal way of existence of capital. That is true. You can detect with different econometric mechanisms and methodologies. You can detect different ways and different type of timing in terms of these cycles. There are the short-term cycles, the long-term cycles, and those cycles have been the opportunity, the occasion for capital to self-purge itself in order to recover growth in a much more vibrant situation, precisely transforming itself in a more efficient system, both in terms of the introduction of new technologies and the construction of a new institutional environment. Unfortunately, in this occasion, it has happened precisely the opposite. What has been reinforced is precisely the type of traits, the type of entrepreneurial traits, the type of institutional traits that led the world to the crisis. Deregulation, fraud are not individual situations, are characteristics of the most important and powerful corporations today, and they have constituted a criminogenic environment. An environment that structurally produces fraud. Fraud is now a generalized type of entrepreneurial practice. You can go further and say, and that is the point of departure of this presentation, the problem is the mix of policies and institutions, what in economics is called the mode of regulation. And of course, you have plenty of evidence that the neoliberal policies are totally exhausted, that the neoliberal policies have led the world to this chaotic situation. But the introduction, more or less coherent, of Keynesian policies there where it is possible to do it, because under the present circumstances, not in all the countries it is possible to deploy Keynesian policies. Even if you can deploy Keynesian policies, other type of policies different from the neoliberals, you cannot get rid of the labor of crisis, of this process of crisis that is at the root, at the core of the system. We can go further, even at the level of the transformation of the international division of labor, the relationship between the capitalistic and the non-capitalistic logics of organization of the society and the production. We can go even further in terms of changing the patterns of dynamic income distribution, or even the relationship with the introduction of the technological paradigms, what is called the Kondratiev cycles, what organizes, what informs the long-term, the 50, 60 years in the historical existence of capitalism. And you can see that even if you can transform the current patterns of social polarization, if you can change the geography of the industrial power in the world, as that is happening already, you cannot solve a much deeper problem that is related to the essential logic of the capitalist mode of production. what is the rate of profit. You know, under the current system, it is impossible to produce something like food, for example, exclusively because people is hungry. No, that's not enough. You need to provide adequate markets to make possible the production. But you need to provide adequate markets with a corresponding rate of profit. And during the last 30, 40 years, it has been generalized. An additional challenge, an additional filter in terms of the viability of the different projects of production. Now, you have a pervasive situation in which productive capital had to serve the interest of a much more powerful master, financial capital. And that has transformed the operation even of the biggest corporations. The paradigmatic firms like General Motors or General Electric of the previous technological paradigm, the paradigmatic firms of the monopolic productive capital are operating today under totally different circumstances than its previous lives. For example, previously General Motors used to have the whole department of engineers devoted to plan the future design of the cars, the models, the aerodynamic designs, the most efficient methods of transmission of energy, better carburants, etc., etc. Lately, the most important concern of this type of firms is related to the financial organization of the cash flow, even if that means to eliminate the entire plant of engineers, even if that means to destroy the long-term construction of loyalties of the workers of the firm, even if that means to destroy cities like Detroit, that was the emblematic cadre of the automobile industry in the United States. What matters now is the cash flow and the possibility of delivering dividends to the stakeholders in order to improve the price of the bonds in the stock market. That has changed completely the functioning, the structure, and the projection of this type of enterprises. You know, the most important financial firm in the world, even bigger than the presence of the so-called investment banks, is General Electric. General Electric was the firm founded by Thomas Alva Edison, an emblematic figure of the invention at the end of the 19th century. The bulb, the generalization of the telephone and the telegraph. Now, most of the earnings of General Motors, of General Electric, of the most important firms related to the production are related to financing, car loans, commercialization, patents, royalties, franchises, all around the world. So the inner circle of capitalism has been transformed. The inner circle of productive capital has been transformed under this new master, financial capital. So it's the logic of this financial capital that forces capital to be more and more speculative, more and more greedy, and with a horizon of a very short term, independently of the internal conditions of the specific process of production. This is very important because that means that millions of productive projects, not on the hands and on the means, on the minds of the so-called small people, but even important corporations, important firms at the level of the regions and the state nations are obliterated by the market because they cannot fulfill the cash flow requirements, the short-termism of the high rates of return that financial capital demand. So right now we need to understand that the problem is not only at the level of the neoliberal policies, the problem is also at the level of the regime of accumulation, at the level of the mode of production, and also at the level of the mode of life. Because this situation of structural crisis of capitalism has created a synchronization with other long-term processes of crisis related to a kind of longue durée, in the sense of Brodel, these long-term processes that are going beyond the capitalist mode of production, including the relationship between man, human beings, and nature, and including the organization of the species, of the humankind, when the demographical trends generate such a big problem in terms of processing the biological and the cognitive situation for solving any type of contradictions, any type of decisions. Right now, we need to create alternatives at the level of the mode of the regulation, that means economic policy, at the level of the regime of accumulation, including the international division of labor, the problems in terms of the free trade agreements, for example, and the doctrine of the comparative advantages, but at the level of the mode of production, that means the tyranny, the dictatorship of the very high rates of profits, and also the problem of the mode of life. We need to change civilization. This is a systemic crisis that requires a systemic alternative. We need to understand that capital now is in a declining phase of its life cycle. This is a senile capitalism that cannot afford to undertake reforms that 20, 30, 50 years ago were very easy for capital to accept. Right now, the only difference among the progressive movements between the reformist reforms and the revolutionary reforms do not exist anymore. Now, all type of reforms, including wage and social benefits for workers, are a permanent and lethal pressure on capital. Not because the macroeconomic situation and the macroeconomic dynamic that these new wages and new benefits could provide in terms of new markets, but in terms of the structure of power. And we need to understand this specific dimension of capital. This is not a technocratical problem. Economics does not exist in the air. This is a problem of power. This is a problem of hegemony. This is a problem of domination. And this is what is at stake right now, precisely. We need then to create a political action that takes into account this systemic crisis of capitalism and to detect which are the neuralgic points in which one can concentrate political energy in order to obtain larger transformations. You know, in normal times, all the blocks of the system operate in such a coordinated way, in such a lubricated way, that you need to invest large amounts of social energy in order to obtain tiny reforms. Now, because of this systemic crisis, you have impasses everywhere, in several planes of the reality, both in the objective reality and in the subjective reality. This is not only a crisis of production, this is also the production of goods and services. This is also a crisis in the production of sense. This is a legitimacy crisis. So we have plenty of opportunities of creating an alternative. And there is no blueprint for this. I cannot solve the other part of the question. Which are the alternatives? The alternatives must be a collective construction, a plural, fresh and collective construction, in which all the peoples, all the cultures in the planet should participate. Now we need, unfortunately, and that's the pressure, we need to act quickly. Time runs against the interests of the people. The transnational oligarchical agenda is deploying with such a ferocity its interest in the middle of this crisis, in a situation in which a lot of irreversibilities are jeopardizing not only the welfare of the people, but also in the medium and long term, the survival of the species. I'm talking about the possibility of a new scenario, in the very near future, a new scenario of geopolitical complications with a perpetual trend towards conflict and war. Stabilization, conflict, and war. I'm thinking about a new scenario in the very near future in which the anthropogenic alterations of the climate could render the situation of humanity, could render the situation of 7 billion human beings very difficult in the current circumstances and in the current distribution of collective forces. So now we have the very delicate responsibility of presenting an agenda, a programmatic agenda, with the lucidity that could solve immediate tactical urgencies of the conjuncture with a very strategic horizon that could solve the construction, that could open the doors for the collective construction of an alternative in terms of economic policy, in terms of regime of accumulation, in terms of mode of production, and in terms of mode of life. That is the modest chore that we have to undertake, compañeros. Okay, let me start with a very telegraphic characterization of the current crisis. You know, what has imploded in the last 3-4 years is not capitalism. It's the remedy that the structural crisis of capital demanded 40 years ago. And the alternative to the fall to the rate of profit was precisely to have these counter tendencies based upon the technological change, the delocalization of production from the center to the semi-periphery, including countries like South Korea, and financialization. Let's see how this operates. This is a qualified version of the old Marxist theory of crisis and the contributions of Schumpeter and Keynes, basically. So the idea is that this is a crisis of overproduction. For capital, the old type of crisis, the crisis of scarcity, are things of the past. Now, capital is prisoner of its own success. The tremendous development of productive forces that the introduction of science and technology in the labor process produces have created a relative overproduction of products, but also an overproduction of capitals, overaccumulation. Of course, the problem of overproduction is directly related to underconsumption, and everything is relative. Because we have, for example, right now the possibilities to produce several times the requirements for food for all the humanity. However, the conditions of income distribution, the conditions of power, define the situation that right now people in Africa, brothers and sisters in Africa, are dying because pennies have failed to prevent this type of food crisis. So we have a problem of overproduction that is also combined with the anarchy of the market in terms of the disproportionality that today used to be the main concern of macroeconomists in the common expression of the global imbalances. Deficits in the United States, surpluses in Asia. These two permanent characteristics of capital are not problem until they affect the pocket of capitalists, the rate of profit. And that's the real problem, is the anarchy in the market, is the permanent and increasing uncertainty in the market, and the lack of effective demand that has created such a situation in which too much merchandises had reduced, had compressed the rate of profit. And that is the origin of the problem that symptomatically appeared in a generalized way in the center of the system since the middle of the 60s. Facing this, you have a permanent dialectic, a permanent interaction between these three tendencies that in total configure what one can call the loss of profit. Those loss of profits are expressed permanently under two historical mechanisms. The first one is what Marx called the primitive accumulation. In Spanish, is originary accumulation, frozen sometime in the 16th, 17th century with the enclosures and the conquest of America and the slavery in Africa, etc., etc. We believe that no, this is a permanent process, a process that recreates itself in an amplified way in terms of a progressive present conjugation. This is an originating accumulation. That is the permanent process of dispossession of the producers from the means of production and the accumulation of wealth and means of production and means of payments in one specific and narrower minority. And the other one is related to the ordinary accumulation that usually we not even feel it. We don't even analyze it because it's business as usual. We call it competition. The permanent asphyxiation of the minor actors in the market in favor of the oligopolies and the monopolization of fewer and fewer corporations. And that this type of relationship organizes the rhythm and the orientation of the investment decisions. This is directly related, especially in the periphery, with the problems of unpaid work, the dispossession, the commodification of nature and the commons, waste, work, and dispossession of rights and public goods. That's the modern tendencies of capital. The relationship of these laws of profit, the combination between originating and ordinary accumulation, are the main mechanisms of capitalist growth. But the trend to the compression of the rate of profit demands a permanent transformation in terms of technology and in terms of the institutions, the historical existence of capital. They need to create permanent constant tendencies to that compression of the rate of profit. The dialectic between the tendency to the fall of the rate of profit and the counter tendencies is what is called the mode of regulation. The most immediate toolbox for facing these tendencies is the usual instruments of economic policy and the creation of some regulations or the dismantling of those regulations. The mode of regulation, this can be between institutions and the mix of policies, are the framework in which some specific regime of accumulation is viable. That means this combination of policies render some specific dynamics in income distribution, render some specific relationship with the state, with the non-capital production, and in the international division of labor, what is called the regime of accumulation. The relationship, the dialectic between both of them are precisely the content of the cycles and the occasion and the opportunity in time of the financial crisis. We need to understand this because we can illustrate what we follow in theoretical terms with some statistics. Look, the overproduction is a constant in the center of the system since the 60s. This is a prolonged contractive phase in the sense that this time, opposite to what happened in other structural crises, it will be futile. All the efforts for capital to jump, to have a qualitative jump towards a new technological paradigm that could render investment more and more profitable. One of the main vectors of this impasse is the problem with easy fossil fuels. The cheap fuels have been the core of the technological innovation during the last 2 centuries, 1.5 centuries. Now, problems in the geopolitical logistic of energy provision are one of the main obstacles or one of the main discriminants in terms of the constitution of monopolies and the formation, the hierarchical formation of the rate of profit. United States, England had in that realm a huge advantage with respect to any type of rival in terms of the logistic provision of energy. The percentage of use of the industrial capacity had followed this declining line, not only in the United States, but also in the rest of the core countries, Europe and Japan. And this is directly related to the social polarization that the neoliberal policies have provoked. That you can see here in this data of the income share of the top 1% in the United States since the 1913 until today, that the concentration of income after the Reagan economic policies have achieved the same level of polarization than in the period that preceded the previous crash in 1929. And the same happens, as you can see in this graph, in terms of the inequality within countries. You can have some specific situations of improvement in terms of the reduction of poverty, but that hasn't prevent the increase in inequality, even in the cases of China, India, Vietnam, or South Korea. That situation implies something that is totally unsustainable. It is not possible to produce more and more and to pay less and less, because there are not enough markets to absorb, to give a realization to the surplus value generated in the productive process. So check these statistics, these macroeconomic statistics for the 6 more industrialized countries: United States, Japan, Germany, France, the United Kingdom, and Italy. And you can see, we don't have time to go into the details, but here in the gross black line, you can see the rate of profit. And this series comes from the golden years of capital after the Second World War, with a very auspicious level and dynamics, and suddenly, during the 60s, you have a permanent decline that shows the exhaustion of the Keynesian Fordist regime of accumulation. Look, the continuation of this series after the application by Mrs. Thatcher and Mr. Reagan of different economic policies, not only in their nation states but all around the world, have recovered the rate of profit for the corporations on those countries, but also for the corporations in the rest of the north, in the global north, in the core of the system. But the result, or the cost of this situation, is this type of contradiction. Look at this graph in which you can see the wage share in the GDP in this line with the white dots that have been compressed in the last decades, precisely because of the application of the neoliberal policies. And in the black dots you can see the evolution of household consumption. During the Fordist Keynesian regime of accumulation, both series had a co-evolution, because the principal market for consumption during the golden years was precisely wage labor. The main earning of the families in those countries was predominantly wage. The compression of wages could render a permanent recession in the center of the system all this period. The only way to compensate that situation, that is why we call it counter tendencies, was credit. This trend, this upward trend in consumption was only possible, was only sustainable because the over-indebtedness of the families, of the households in the center of the system. So over-indebtedness is not only a personal flow of the Americans or the Europeans or the Greeks. This is a structural need of capitalism. The other side of this coin is precisely, again, we have here the evolution of the rate of profit. Yes, you have a recovery of the rate of profit after the neoliberal policies, but this recovery of the rate of profit was not accompanied by an increase in productive investment in this graph represented by this tiny line with white dots. The gap, this gray gap between the rate of profit, the recovery of the rate of profit, and the compression of productive investment is precisely the multiplication, the appraisal of financial innovations. The key problem of the current conjuncture is the overproduction of capital, is overaccumulation of capital. Too much capital searching for productive opportunities of investment. As they cannot find them, they have to invent opportunities in the realm of the virtual economy, in the realm of fictitious capital. So, the irrational exuberance that Mr. Greenspan denounced is not a flaw of character of some bankers. Financial fraud, speculation are a structural need of the system. And this hasn't stopped. This cannot be solved through a process of deleveraging. This cannot be solved through a process of re-regulation. This cannot be solved through a massive process of judiciary persecution of the delinquency involved in this type of financial innovation. If you eliminate this mass, this tremendous mass, this colossal mass of financial investment, you would have a structural recession decades ago. That situation has created a dynamics in which you can see a dichotomic dynamics between the real economy, in this case represented by the global GDP as a very approximated measure of the real economy that has not only declined within the last decades, but has also increased the level of volatility. More volatility, more uncertainty, more speculation. And look at this contrast with the evolution of just one of the indicators of the financial innovations that are the statistics, because there is no exhaustive statistics and rigorous statistics about all the financial innovations. This is only one of the most important financial innovations called derivatives. This deceleration of the real economy, the explosive growth of speculation. Right now, just to have an idea of the margin of the order of magnitude involved in this disproportionality, the total GDP represents $63 trillion, and the amount of total debts, the registered debts in the national accounting, the state, the public debt, the household debt, and the enterprise debt represent twice $117 trillion. But the total amount of debt represented by the financial derivatives by the toxic assets is $1,500 trillion. So we are talking about a huge problem, a structural problem of insolvency. You know, like in the case of the Southeast Asian crisis, government corruption, regulatory capture, generous policies with the taxpayer money, bailing out, and all type of chronic capitalism could water down gradually the problems of insolvency of some banks, but not at this level. You would need something like 25 years of 7 billion people not eating in order to bail out the level of insolvency that a handful of investment banks have in the north of the system, in the center of the system. That is the level, that is the severity of this crisis. Of course, in terms of sensibility, in terms of the long-term horizon of capital, the most reasonable measure should be to eliminate that fictitious capital, to write down all these unpayable debts, and to solve the problem, to purge the system, and to resume growth. But we cannot forget that we are talking about structures of power. We are talking about the most powerful corporations in the world, the most important interest behind the nation states, the imperialist nation states. We are talking about the real power, the real power. They are not going to renounce to their claims. And that is the impasse that we are facing today. That is why the Occupy Wall Street movement presents the very blunt situation of the 99% against the 1%. And again, as I mentioned, let me go a little bit quickly in these slides. This is the evolution of the real economy versus the registered debt. But that has nothing to do with the actual transactions in the financial realm. You know, this is nothing. I mentioned $117 trillion versus $1,500 trillion. But look, the discrepancy is not only in quantitative terms, it's also qualitative. Those are the global imbalances, the nightmare of the macroeconomists and the day-to-day discussion among the G20 countries. When you have the summit last year, that was the main source of conflicts, the main source of news, of financial news and political news in the papers. Here you have the permanent deficit of the United States, the recent deficit in Europe, and the alleged financing of those deficits on behalf of China and the rest of Asia, the rest of developing countries. Pay attention to this. This spaghetti shows the real directionality of the financial transactions. The actual financial transactions represented by the arrow and by the thickness, the width of the line represent the amount of transactions. Where is the financing from China to the United States here? Difficult to see. The most important transactions are within the financial centers: Wall Street, the city of London, Frankfurt, Paris, Hong Kong, Tokyo, Singapore, Middle East, Australia, etc. And the relationships between those financial centers. We are talking about a self-referent apparatus trying to decouple from the real economy. Something that we know is totally impossible because the only source of profits come from the productive sector. The only source of wealth is the real sector. The speculative apparatus, with all the sophistication, with all the mathematics involved in the design, is only a redistributional operation. And that is part of the dispute, of the power dispute. Who is going to resign their claims on the created wealth? And that is the dispute among the countries of the G20, and that is the bloody struggle among fractions of capital. You know, Lehman Brothers, a very intimate partner in the structure of oligarchical power for the last 150 years, is not a structure of power anymore. Their own survival is at stake today. That is the nature of the current crisis. And the key engine of that dispute is related to liquidity. Because since the breakdown of the Bretton Woods Accords in 1971, that means since the US dollar started to be issued without any type of collateral, any type of backup, you have a permanent process of decoupling of this virtual economy with respect to the real economy. From this time, since that time, you have a different logic in the structuration of power based upon political and military situations. That is an important part of the understanding of the crisis unfolding and the limits for capital to present solutions to that situation. But also, that is the key for understanding which is the agenda of the progressive forces. We need to stop the agenda of the speculative oligarchical powers that have been deployed so far. The structure of the financial system today is a kind of inverted pyramid. And in the point, in the cusp, you have a new structure, a parallel structure within the same larger banks that is called shadow banking. Now, the provision of liquidity coming specifically from different triangulations, different pyramidations of the financial innovations come out of this type of the so-called toxic assets. That is why all this system is based upon the monopoly, the international monopoly of liquidity that retain the US dollar. A US dollar that could be issued without apparent limits out of the blue by the Federal Reserve of the United States. That is the key of the matter. That is why Europe, continental Europe, a much healthier economy in terms of industrial power, is on its knees with respect to the United States. Because the provision of liquidity for the larger European banks depend on the provision of liquidity of the Federal Reserve. And the banks that you have here, the most powerful banks here in Asia, depends on the United States dollar liquidity. Why? Because every transaction that you made, every international transaction that you made, you have to do it in dollars. Some commercial transactions could be made in other type of currency, and that is part of the dispute That is the main interest of the United States, of the Anglo-American axis, to erode the capabilities of the euro, the main rival in terms of the international indices, but at the same time, all the financial transactions are made basically in dollars. Even the transactions, the more elemental transactions that your central bank adopt with any neighbor country has to be made in dollars and through private bank in the United States, passing through the Federal Reserve of the United States to the corresponding bank of the other central bank in the United States. You know the inefficiency involved in this situation. You know the increasing costs for the private sector and for the public sector that this type of intermediation represents. Why so? Because that artificial demand, that artificial international demand is the only mechanism that the United States have in order to sustain the international value of the dollar. That is why the United States can issue larger and larger amounts of dollars. Check. That is why the United States could launch exponential growth in terms of the monetary aggregates without any type of resource in terms of domestic inflation. That is what is a dispute today, because that exorbitant asymmetric power of the United States and the United States corporations has rendered not only a very powerful situation in terms of the capabilities of the macroeconomic and financial capabilities of bailing out their corporations, but also is the main source of financing of the industrial military complex. That is the main source of financing of all the overreaching of military adventures and invasions in the rest of the world. That is at the center of the dispute for the hegemony in this conjuncture. Okay, very quickly. That situation has created a dispute also within the structure of power, the block of power in the United States and in Europe, in the center countries, because the increasing importance of the financial profits with respect to the dynamic of the GDP and the other type of profits. Increasingly, the most important realm of reproduction of monopoly capital came out of finance, that means exaction activities, rent-seeking activities, and not out of profits, entrepreneurial profits. And you know, again, capital is prisoner of its own success. This graph is the illustration. This is a map of the most important corporations in the world. Out of 37 million corporations of a database of 2007, 43,000 corporations are the more fundamental due to the interlinks among them. This graph is made out of a technique of network topology that allow them to represent the links between corporations and the clusters, the most important clusters in the productive structure in the globe. Among those 37 million corporations, only 1,300 control 60% of the global GDP. But only 147 control 40% of the GDP. So to say 99% against 1% is a clear exaggeration. Not even 1% of that 1% of the population has the ownership of these 147 corporations. You have here, and you have available this presentation to study. Those are the 50 most important corporations out of these 147. And again, you are going to find here the most important banks of speculative banks that created the international chaos that we live today. But more so, it was revealed in a recent audit to the Federal Reserve that just one of the programs of the Federal Reserve, one of the bailout programs of the Federal Reserve, poured $16 trillion in a handful of banks. You have the list over here. And more interesting, several of these beneficiaries of the largesse of the Federal Reserve of the United States include Royal Bank of Scotland from England, Deutsche Bank from Germany, UBS from Switzerland, Banque Paribas de France, etc. $16 trillion, 110% of the United States GDP. Additional liquidity, additional capital on the hands of this narrow oligarchy in a situation in which they have already a colossal amount of capital searching for opportunities of investment. And in the middle of the recession, and in this technological impasse that we mentioned before, which are the opportunities of productive investment that are not counterproductive in terms of the compression of the rate of profit? That's the problem. The alternative is the bubblization of the economy, is to control and to create artificially opportunities of investment in which they can gain in the boom and they can gain in the boost. Or to create other opportunities of profit out of conflict, destabilization, war. That is the scenario that we are living today. That is the conjuncture that we are living today. That is the core of the explanation of what is happening in the news every day. Okay, we don't have too much time, so I have to fly. Part of the problem, a very important part of the problem, is that the ammunition, the economic, the financial, the ideological ammunition that the oligarchical powers have today is exhausting. Look, this is the representation of the main monetary aggregates in the United States, and you can see here that this is M1, that means bills and current accounts. This is M2, that means M1 plus saving deposits, and this is M3, that is M2 plus credit. And you can see in this case that the three components follow the mandate of the economic policy, of the monetary policy of the Federal Reserve, because they follow more or less the same pattern. At some point, you have a total decoupling of that situation. The expansion of credit in the middle of a restrictive, a very tight monetary policy. And that was due to the total deregulation of the leverage normative, the prudential normative during this period. At points like Lehman Brothers, with a ratio between own capital and loans of 333%. The normal ratio is around 10 to 1. That means that not only the Federal Reserve creates a means of payments out of the blue, but also the banks are permanently creating more and more means of payments out of the blue, just by sleight of hand, magic. It was so serious, the situation, that the Federal Reserve stopped publishing the aggregate in March 2006. Because it was very clear that the discrepancy and the explosive increase in credit, it was unsustainable. But check this situation. The system of credit started to disintegrate at the beginning of 2008, way before the implosion of Lehman Brothers. Lehman Brothers is here. You have free fall since the beginning of 2008. But look, M1, the injection of liquidity of the first bailout, Mr. Paulson going to the Congress of the United States and blackmailing them with the end of the world if they do not approve the bailing out of the banks. A huge injection of liquidity, almost 100% of increase in money, and a very tiny increase in terms of credit. That means the whole injection of money has no effects in terms of productive credit, in terms of employment, in terms of GDP, in terms of economic activity. The next package, quantitative easing one, this time under Obama. Here, the effects in terms of credit almost nil. And this one is quantitative easing 2. Nothing. More so, this is 0, so we are talking about negative rates of growth. Disintegration of the credit system in the United States. That is the real situation that we are facing now. We have, as you can see here, some slight recovery, but still in negative terms, that was immediately reversed by the recent discussion between Republicans and Democrats around the debt ceiling. Well, another source of weakness is the generalized substitution of portfolios of most of the emerging economies, not only the public sector but also the private sector. You can see here the holdings of US Treasury bonds on behalf of Russia, but you can see the same type of pattern in the case of India, in the case of China, in the case of South Korea. No profile, but a permanent, systematic substitution of the international reserves and the reserves of the private sector from dollar-denominated financial assets towards real wealth representation in the financial assets, and from this to real wealth, including physical gold, that right now represent one of the main vectors of instability because of the multiplication of property rights for the same subjacent real assets. That means that you have at the same time different owners of the same piece of gold, different owners of the same mortgage contract, different owners of the same barrel of oil, and this is a generalized situation. So it is not the communists, not the anarchists, not the Taliban that have destroyed the private property. It is the financial capital that has destroyed private property. That is the level of severity of this crisis. Okay, and again, we have to check very, very closely the dispute, the crisis of hegemony, represented, among other things, in terms of the relocalization of industrial power from the situation of the industrialized countries, the blood evolution, versus the increasing power of the semi-periphery, the so-called BRICS, the so-called emerging economies. Okay. This situation put us at the verge of a new episode of depression, a new plunging of the system. You can see here the last estimations of the GDP evolution in the center. GDP is not a real estimate of the real economy. It's a very misleading indicator. But even with this indicator that could be artificially inflated through the bailouts, if you pour $16 trillion in an economy like the United States one, in which 80% depends upon the FIRE sectors, finance, insurance, and real estate, it is obvious that you have an improvement in the GDP. But that doesn't mean that the real economy has resumed growth. But even under those circumstances, with this very misleading, very confusing, very limited indicator, you can see the synchronization of a recession in the Eurozone, the United States, and Japan, but also a deceleration of the BRICS, of the countries that in the previous episode retained or sustained growth in the global economy. So, we are at the verge of an immediate plunging of the global economy. And this is, of course, the product of long-term regularities in the system, but also is the product of specific design. This is an engineered crisis. It is nothing, there is nothing technical behind the timing of the discussion in Europe, and there is nothing technical behind the timing of the discussion about the debt ceiling in the United States. We are talking about a power dispute, a crisis of hegemony. They are killing each other in the high commands of the empire. So we need to understand this, because what happens there is going to affect our day-to-day lives. The dollar monopoly of international liquidity is precisely one of the most important neuralgic points in this global dispute for hegemony, and it could render very positive effects in terms of the transformation from the interest of the popular classes all around the world. Overproduction leads to a financial hypertrophy. And that implies that Keynesian policies are not enough to get rid of this crisis. More so, it is impossible to get rid of this crisis of capitalism without getting rid of this capitalism in crisis. We are not talking about the collapse of the system. What we are talking is that capital has lost its historical progressive function. Now, it's the chore, is the task of the progressive forces to present alternatives, to open room for other logics of economic and social organization of the day-to-day life. Otherwise, it's the dictatorship of financial capital, which from the short-termism and the speculative interest and the greediness, who's going to organize the economy and the society in the conditions that we have talked so far. So, we are living in the middle of a rapid transformation of the power and domination exercise. From the modern bourgeois type of dominion, we have a neo-oligarchical reversal. From the predominance of ordinary accumulation as we knew, now we have a trend to the predominance of original accumulation. The wars of Libya, the wars of destruction in Afghanistan, Iraq, and possibly in Syria and Iran have as a main purpose a process of dispossession, a process of looting, a process of national destruction, a process of grabbing productive and financial assets. The case of Libya was very clear. The first measure of the humanitarian, between quotes, imperialism, sometimes with the support of some fractions of the left, was to create an alternative central bank and to grab all the debt, all the assets, all the international assets of the nation state. It was a lie that this was property of the Gaddafi family. Now, there are other measures, even more efficient ones, to grab those resources through financial destabilization. Remember what happened here in 1997. Remember the huge transfer of wealth, the denationalization of financial and productive assets of the triumphant South Korean economy on behalf of American, European, and British interests. This is in trend of generalization. This is what is happening even in geographies as powerful ones as the European. So nothing prevents that this type of episodes could happen again in our countries. Precisely because so far we have managed relatively well. Precisely because we were able to accumulate a very succulent amount of financial and productive assets. That's another common ground for common struggles between Latin America and Asia. Okay, I'm going to leave you this the details to discuss the exercise of power under the new circumstances, but you can characterize this degradation of civilization that has happened so quickly, that has been so ferocious, that we have some effective resistance to perceive it. We have it in our noses and we deny them all the time. It's the elephant in the room that every one of us, even among progressive ones, fail to see. The world as we knew it is over. Politics as we knew it are over because the possibility of long-term coalitions, power coalitions, now are totally different. The old linear geometry of politics, right, center, left, has no meaning anymore. Now, this is struggle for survival, even among the most powerful fractions of capital, at the national level and at the international level. And what is at stake right now is an immediate future of destabilization, more bubblization, more speculation, and war. Perpetual war. That's the more profitable of the business today. And in the framework, in the immediate scenario of uncertainty, that is the optimal strategy for any type of capital, even for those fractions that could be called progressive ones. So be very careful. If the left, if the progressive forces cannot present an agenda, a pragmatical agenda for here and now, that could be attractive enough to buy out important fractions of capital, local and transnational capital, to buy them out of this oligarchical agenda of destabilization and conflict, we are going to enter very quickly into a very delicate conjuncture with an important degree of irreversibility. Nothing is written in stone. We are talking about political action. We are talking about human creativity. We are talking about a very specific and glorious period in history, characterized by this ontological intensity, in which what every one of us do matters. Now is the time for the common man. Now is the time for the small people. Now is the time in which our voices, our conscience, our strikes, our demonstrations could change the world. Another world is possible, compañeros. Another development is possible. Another economy is possible. Right now, here. It is not precondition to grab power. We have to build up another type of power from the grassroots organizations, from the day-to-day economy, from the cooperatives, from the small and medium-sized enterprises, from the workers of all types of conditions in every part of the world. And we have plenty of possibilities blocking the oligarchical agenda because they are so powerful and at the same time so weak. The tremendous concentration of capital and power has rendered them in such a situation in which they cannot obey their own laws. All the civilizatory contest that the capitalist modernity brought to humanity, that were prized by Marx and Engels, for example, in the Communist Manifesto, are not functional for capital anymore. Because this oligarchical reversal in the exercise of accumulation, in the exercise of economy, but also in the exercise of power. This crisis of legitimation, this crisis of accumulation is a crucial historical moment for humankind. And it's our duty, it's our responsibility to create the possibilities of another way out of this situation. The alternative to neoliberalism had to be so clever that at the same time could provide an alternative to the day-to-day defense of the economy, of the family and the community for the common man. And at the same time, it must open the doors for another type of transformation, for ulterior, more ambitious horizons of social organization in terms of other values, beyond greed, beyond egotism, beyond individualism. We need to transform not only the mode of production, we need to transform the mode of life. And we have plenty of possibilities, plenty of options in which nobody has the monopoly of the truth or the initiative. This must be a collective construction. This is the moment of the awakening of the peoples. This is the moment in which all the disciplines of knowledge must be summoned in order to build up a responsible and rigorous alternative. I have some propositions that I prefer to leave them to the questions and to the specific interests of you. Some of those propositions are here in terms of an urgent planetary agenda, a new global financial architecture, but also some of them are related to the creation of bloc regional monetary arrangements like what we have created, we are discussing in Latin America around the Bank of the South, around Sucre, around the continental alternative to the IMF. But again, what at the end of the day, I think is the key of the solution is to build up sovereignty, all type of sovereignty, empowerment. This is a moment in which this concentration of power demands a colossal and permanent expropriation of self-determination of the individual, of the communities, of the nation states, of the entire regions. We need to face that drive through a permanent and day-to-day grassroots construction of power, of capabilities. This time is not the old recipe, the very enforced dichotomy between the state and the private sector, or the state and the market. This is the moment of creativity. And we have plenty of possibilities. Another world is possible, compañeros. Another world is possible here and now. Thank you very much.
상당히 중요한 지점을 지적해 주셨습니다. 그래서 이 자리에 빌려서 간단하게 몇 가지 질문을 한꺼번에 드리고자 합니다. 먼저 그 FTA의 본질에 대해서 FTA가 자유무역협정이라는 상당히 좋은 말을 가지고 있지만 또 한편으로는 법이나 제도를 통합하는 이러한 측면들인데 FTA의 본질이 무엇인지 그거 하나고요. 그 다음에 하나는 FTA에서 가장 큰 문제점이 뭔지, 그래서 그 멕시코라든가 에콰도르 그런 상황을 해서 좀 사례를 들어서 설명해 주시면 좋겠고요. 마지막으로는 우리 이 한미 FTA 조약에 있어서 폐기 조항이 있다고 합니다. 그래서 그 한국이나 미국이나 어느 한 국가가 이거에 대해서 폐기를 요구하면 180일이 지나면 그 협정이 폐기되도록 하는 조항이 있답니다. 그래서 이 야권이 내년 총선에서 승리를 한다면 국회에서 그러한 결의를 통해서 한미 FTA를 폐기할 수 있다. 그래서 한미 FTA 폐기 운동이 전개될 거로 예상되는데요. 에콰도르에서는 한미 FTA 이 협정을 중단한 협상을 중단한 사례가 있다고 합니다. 그래서 마지막 질문은 에콰도르에서 그 FTA, 미국과 FTA 협상을 폐기하게 된 그 과정이나 그런 근거에 대해서 말씀해 주시면 감사하겠습니다.
First of all, like in war, the first casualty with the FTAs is truth. Nothing to do with free, nothing to do with trade. The most important offensive interest in the bilateral free trade agreements are related to investment, government procurement, establishment, intellectual property. All those areas more related to services and financial services, including the impossibility of re-regulation at the nation-state level. And you have to be very careful, because the way in which those type of treaties are composed present a lot of complexities, technical complexities, with a lexicon that only the specialists used to know. But the moment in which a country could be sued in the international tribunals for dispute in investment mechanisms, or a dispute at the WTO for any commercial situation, it's not only the text. It's the text, it's the context, and the pretext that matters. And they can articulate, they can weigh this paragraph and this sentence here in the bilateral investment treaty with this paragraph here in your adhesion to the WTO, with this paragraph here in the bilateral free trade agreement, and with the clause of most favored nation that you have with the neighbors, and any other type of regional initiative. The real content of the free trade agreement is the facility for the monopoly creation on behalf of the United States and Europe. They retain the power and the attribution to maintain national policies of development, national subsidies, but they preclude any possibility for us to protect our production and to protect our jobs. In the case of Latin America, that was very clear. Mexico is the oldest free trade agreement of any Latin American country in the United States. 1995. Let me tell you one example. Staple in Mexico, as you have here with the kimchi, is the tortilla. The day-to-day food of the common people is the corn, the maize tortilla, and beans. Suddenly, with the free trade agreement, they had to open the borders for the introduction of corn from the United States with huge subsidies that you cannot name them even. Now, those are out of the discussion. Huge subsidies that rendered unviable all the Mexican production of corn from farmers and for small, medium, and large size agriculture. The destruction of the productive fabric at the regional level was so quick, so rapid, that in a matter of 3-4 years you have 11 million immigrants crossing the border toward the United States because they could not survive in the lands of their parents. This depopulation of the region provides a scenario for land grab, on behalf of whom? The narco-traffickers, the drug dealers. Because the few survivors, even women's, mothers, wives, that rested in the small pieces of land were buried out of the land, and they had to make kind of fire sales in a situation in which the economic conditions, the economic alternative for the youth were totally new. So the option was to sell the land or to engage in the drug gangs. That is the situation that had led Mexico to this condition of failed state. Of course, some businessmen in Mexico had profited a lot with the new type of maquila in the north of the Mexican frontier. But this maquila has nothing to do with the rest of the productive apparatus in Mexico. It's a precarious job with internal migration, with the destruction of the economic and social tissue of the sources of this manpower, and profits for the United States. The situation of the productive apparatus in Mexico is totally degraded. Mexico was the leading force in industrial terms in Latin America, in cultural terms in Latin America, in diplomatic terms in Latin America. Now, Mexico. And that is, we are talking of one of the most industrialized countries in Latin America, one of the institutional structure more robust and more ancient, more specialized than any other apparatus in the rest of the country. Now you have a total dismantling of the productive apparatus, a total dismantling of the institutions, and the weakness of the historical subjects. Because that has affected not only the ideology and the projections, the societal projections of the different classes, social classes, but also the morals of those classes. That is the very specific result of a free trade agreement. We need to create the widest alliances, the most agile and ductile mechanisms of coordination between the struggles here, the struggles in Latin America, and the struggles in Africa also. This myth of the free trade is involving a process of more concentration and centralization of capitals and power in the context of this overproduction crisis. There is too much production for the profitability of the system, and guess who is going to get bankruptcy?
네, 감사합니다. 선생님께서 답변 중에 하나를 이제 시간상 생략하는데 제가 말씀드리면 파일즈 선생님께서는 그 재정부 차관으로 재직하고 계실 때 에콰도르가 미국과 FTA를 맺는 걸 이러한 협정을 중단시키는데 앞장섰다고 합니다. 더 자세한 것들은 인터뷰 기사나 또 이제 지금까지 해왔던 토론 동영상들이 인터넷에 올라온 걸 보시면 되고요. 특히 이제 이질한 부분은 좀 이따가 폐막 토론회가 있습니다. 네, 양해 말씀드릴 거는 이 자리에 이제 기자 두 분이 오셔서 시간상 먼저 기자들 두 분한테 질문할 시간을 드리고 나머지 이제 질문하실 분들은 이후에 폐막 토론회라든가 이때 좀 질문을 해줄 것을 시간상 양해를 드립니다. 그럼 먼저 그 두 분, 기자 두 분이 질문을 하신다. 질문 내용이 준비되셨나요? 네, 손 들어주십시오. 네. 민중의 소리와 한겨레에서 기자분이 오셨다고. 지금 자리에 떴나요? 그러면은, 지금, 질문이 준비가 안 된 걸로 보이니까, 여기 이 플로어에서 딱 한 분 정도만 이 질문을 받고, 이 코너는 이제 끝내고, 다음에 폐막 토론할 때 또 자세한 이야기를 하겠습니다. 그러면 플로어에 계신 분 중에 오늘 그 강연한 내용 중심으로 해가지고 질문하실 분 있으면 좋겠습니다. 외국 분도 좋고요, 국내 분도 좋고 질문하실 분. 네, 오늘 선생님께서 원래 완벽하게 강연을 해주셔서 질문이 없는 걸로 알고 좀 이따 폐막 토론할 때 시간당에 많은 훌륭한 석학분들과 또 한국의 학자들, 정치인들이 같이 토론할 자리가 있으니까 그 부분에 대해서는 더 충분한 토론을 좀 하겠습니다. 오늘 코너는 이것으로 좀 마치기로 그렇게 하겠습니다. 선생님 감사합니다. 자, 박수 한번 드리도록 하겠습니다.